The Battlehosts. Be a better gamer, build a better community.
Welcome to The Battlehosts, a podcast and website dedicated to helping you become a better 40K gamer and to build a better community of players. I'm your host, Mark, and tonight I am all by myself. I'm flying solo for this one. We are, as I record this, we are in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's April 2020, and everyone, myself and all of my co-hosts are basically in our homes right now. We're all social distancing, and we're only allowed to go out for sort of essential reasons. So, and then the last couple of weeks has been kind of difficult because we've just, it's the new reality. Most of us are working from home at this point. Some of our kids are actually at home going to school. So, the last couple of weeks have been, kind of a flurry of trying to figure things out. But I wanted to get a podcast out just because I hate kind of missing the twice a month podcast rate that I'm at. So this one is I want to record, and the subject tonight is Mathhammer. And of course, the thing about Mathhammer is it's not really, it's one of those things that I can cover myself because it's kind of a straightforward topic. So tonight we're going to cover Mathhammer myself, but this is first of a two-part series on Mathhammer. The next episode after this, I have an interview with Brandon Grant to talk about how he uses Mathhammer for list building and kind of pre-planning for his games. But if you like what you hear, subscribe to us on iTunes and YouTube to catch all the latest episodes. You can also follow us on Facebook under The Battlehosts. If you'd like to support The Battlehosts for as little as $1 a month, please visit patreon.com/thebattlehosts. If you join for $3 a month, you get access to our Discord chat where we discuss all things related to the hobby. In this episode, we're going to talk Mathhammer, as I mentioned, using basic math to determine the offensive or defensive effectiveness of a particular unit in 40K. As I mentioned, this is part one of a two-part series. So in this part, we're going to talk about the attack sequence, the roll to hit, the roll to wound, and then the save, and how to determine the probability of causing a wound. It's actually really pretty simple math. All you're doing is multiplying decimals, basically, or fractions. We're going to talk about the mechanics of the game that can improve your odds, including rerolls, modifiers, AP values, and then just sheer volume of firepower, which tends to overwhelm even the worst odds often. If you throw enough dice at something, eventually you'll get something through. Finally, we're going to talk about variability and how randomness can impact your game plan. In part two, when we talk to Brandon Grant, we'll talk about list building and how to prepare for games by knowing the capabilities of your units. With Mathhammer, you don't really have to, it's pretty simple stuff to do. And also in part two, we'll talk about some of the resources that you can tap yourself to do your own version of Mathhammer as you start to look at and build your own lists and start to look at units or things that you want to put together to play the game of 40K. Now, before we jump into the topic, let's hear a word from our sponsor, DGT.
We all love Warhammer 40K, but sometimes games just take too long. Using a game timer is the best way to make sure games finish and for both players to get an equal amount of time. Check out the Easy Game Timer from DGT, manufacturers and designers of the timers officially sanctioned by the International Chess Federation. It's simple to set up and customize, and your settings are saved when it's turned off. It's easy to use with a large moving lever for changing turns and a clear digital readout. It's the most affordable and high-quality game timer on the market and is the choice of most 40K events. Whether you want to practice before a big event or you just want to be a better player, the Easy Game Timer from DGT is the perfect game timer for your 40K events. The DGT Easy Game Timer is available from many online retailers. Wholesale pricing is also available for tournament organizers. Check these fine clocks out at dgtnorthamerica.com. Speed up your game and improve your play with the Easy Game Timer from DGT.
And we're back. All right, so Mathhammer. It's kind of a funny term that I heard, I think, when I first started getting into 40K, and it's just sort of it's basically just how to determine the likelihood of causing a wound, and also you can use it to figure out the average number of wounds a unit can cause to another unit. Because 40K uses a D6 system, and D6 actually has a pretty simple probabilities. You roll a dice, and you have a 1 in 6 chance of getting one of the facings on the dice. It's really simple to figure out the probability of a particular dice roll. When you look at 40K, you have a sequence of dice rolls, and so it's not difficult to figure out the probability of causing a wound, and then also looking at sort of the average damage a particular unit can cause. From there, you really can look at any unit you have in the game under different circumstances and figure out basically how likely it is to cause damage to something else. You can math hammer out every unit you like, but the real purpose of this podcast is to provide you with some guidelines to follow when list building and then also when playing the game. Let's talk about the D6 system. The probability for rolling a number or higher is as follows. So rolling any particular facing is, as I mentioned, it's 1/6 or about 16.7%, about 17%. So on a 2-up, because the only failure on a 2-up is a 1, you have an 83% chance, 83.3% chance of rolling a 2-up. So something has a ballistic skill of 2 and you roll a single dice, 83% of the time it's going to be a 2 or greater. So to roll a 3-up, it's 66.6% of the time you're going to roll a 3-up, or about 67%. I'm kind of, I just like to kind of average these things out. Sometimes the decimals get a little bit clunky, so we'll just go from now on. 67% is a 3-up. 4-up is 50%, because half the dice facings are 4 or better, so half the time you're going to roll a 4-up. A 5-up is 33%, and a 6-up is 17%. So as you might expect, when you're looking at 40K where it's a dice facing plus, the higher the number you need, the lower the probability. Pretty simple. I think we all kind of know that. Every change, though, on the dice makes a big difference. So when we talk about modifiers, a +1 or a -1 to these dice rolls does make a big, big difference, because going from a 83%, which is a 2-up, to a 67%, which is a 3-up, does have a pretty big impact in the game, especially when you're throwing lots of dice at something. So the probabilities, because we only use a D6, and because 40K has, I mean, even though Apocalypse uses, I think, a D20, but 40K is kind of stuck with the D6 system, and there's really there's a limit to how much you can really provide enough of a variance in what the probabilities are between rolling with just 6 potential results. When you look at whether you need to hit or whether you need to wound, oftentimes my rule of thumb, and this is just me, this is just a rough rule of thumb that I have, is I always try to go for at least a 4-up. So especially when I'm looking at strength versus toughness, the stuff that I try to target, I think I always try to go for at least a 4-up or better, because a 5-up feels, because you only have a 33% chance of rolling a 5-up, 5-up feels like, unless I have a massive volume of dice, I will usually forego that, or unless it's just the only thing. Like, say, for example, I have something that I need to shoot at, and let's say I have a Marine, which has a strength 4 bolter, and I would typically want to fire at things that are toughness 4 or below with that bolter. Shooting at something that's toughness 5 jumps to a 5-up, and I kind of hate to do that because it's an inefficient use of sort of the firepower there. So yeah, I will do it if I have to, but you can't rely on a 5-up. And even a 4-up is only 50-50. So in general, when you look at your strength versus toughness, the strength of your weapons, of your units, versus the toughness of the opponent's models, you really want to sort of go for at least a 4-up, better times having a 3-up. Because in this game, I mean, you have strength 2 all the way to strength 10 and above. Most of the time, some weapons are a lot higher, but usually you're looking at about strength 2 to strength 8. So there's a huge variance in the number of strength, because it'll go all the way past 10, but the only time you get a 4-up is if it's exactly the same as the toughness. So oftentimes you're looking at 3s or 5s. So good rule of thumb too is go for the 4-up, but for the most part, you want to shoot at something and you want to wound something on a 3. The same with hitting. I mean, if there's so many minuses to hit that you have to have a 5 or a 6 to hit, it becomes really, really difficult unless, again, you have a lot of volume of firepower. So every change in the dice makes a big difference in the probability. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we look at modifiers. Okay, now let's talk about the attack sequence. Now, assuming you have at least one model in your unit in range and you have line of sight, so these are the two things you have to do in order to shoot at something, or you are within 1 inch of an enemy model. In this case, you can use a melee. Assuming you meet those conditions, you have a certain formula, and it is roll to hit, which is either ballistic skill or weapon skill, roll to wound, and then the opponent gets to roll to saves. And so you're looking for unsaved wounds. So what is the probability of an unsaved wound? And that is the probability of causing a wound. So then you would roll damage. If you roll damage, sometimes the damage is a flat rate, sometimes it's like a D3 or a D6. And then if your opponent has a ignore wound roll, then that will be another roll on top of the attack sequence. So there's actually quite a lot of steps just to wound or destroy a model. So roll to hit, roll to wound, roll saves, roll damage maybe, or flat damage. And then if they have it, they can roll their ignore wound or their feel no pain. So how to calculate? Now, there's a couple ways you can do this. And Brandon Grant, when you'll hear in his interview next time, he kind of does it like the brute force way. And the brute force way is to literally take a spreadsheet and you have 3 columns. The first column is the hit. The second column is the wound. And then the third column is the save. And what you're going to do is you're going to write out every single combination of D6 between the 3 rolled in sequence. So the first one will be I roll a 1. The column, basically column 1, row 1, will be I rolled a 1. Second one will be I rolled a 1, and then the third one will be 1. So you'll go 1, 1, 1 across. Then you'll go 1, 1, 2 across. And then you go 1, 1, 3 across, and then 1, 1, 4, 1, 1, 5, 1, 1, 6, and then you'll go 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 2, 1, 2, 3, and you kind of go all the way down. And if you do that, you basically have 216 possible combinations between rolling a D6 dice 3 times in a row. So there's 216 possible combinations of the different results of the first die roll to the second die roll to the third die roll. Now, because the dice rolls are all independent from each other, it's actually pretty easy to figure out. It's basically 6 times 6 times 6, which is 216. Now, a Marine shooting a bolter at a Marine with strength 4, AP 1. So let's say I have a Stalker bolt rifle, and I'm hitting on 3s. I'm wounding on 4s. So I hit on 3s, I wound on 4s. Stalker bolt rifles have an AP -1. So they're saving on a 4-up. So it is 36 out of the 216 combinations, and your probability is about 17%. If you go through all of those combinations and you sort of pick out all the ones that are hits or the ones that will be success, the sequence of the 1, 2, 3s, that 3 columns that are a success, you'll get 36 of them out of the 216, which again, 17%. Now, you can brute force really anything. You can use a spreadsheet to actually figure out, because again, we use D6 systems here, you can figure out any number of sequences. Just at some point, there's a lot of rows, and there's a lot of rows of numbers that you would have to sort of create in a lot of columns, and it can get really quite huge, but it makes a lot of sense that way. So if you ever are bored and you want to create a spreadsheet to figure all this out, you can do that just simply by counting. So you line it all out, and then you simply count the successes, and you divide by the total number of combinations, and there's your percentage. But you can also do the easier route, which is simply to multiply the probabilities. So in this case, that Marine is hitting on a 3-up, which is 67% chance of 66.6, but 67% chance to cause a hit. Then he's wounding on a 4-up, which is a 50% chance. So then the opponent is failing a save on a 3 or less, because it's an AP -1. That's a 50% chance of an unsaved wound. So you just multiply all those up. So you multiply 67% times 50% times 50%, and you get 17%. You go about it either way, but one way is a spreadsheet way. The other way is just simply multiplying the probabilities. In both cases, you are getting the probability of causing a wound from a single attack. Now, for multi-damage weapons, you actually can average the roll to kind of get an expected average. So if the weapon has D3 damage, you can say, okay, well, if the probability of causing a wound would be 17% for a Stalker bolt rifle, because it has a it's a damage 2 weapon. So 17% of the time, a Marine shooting a Stalker bolt rifle at another Primaris Marine, for example, will cause 2 damage, thereby killing that particular Marine, unless that Marine has a apothecary nearby, in which case he'll get a save after that as well. You can see that the mortal wound mechanic in 40K is really a great source of damage, because what it's doing is it's actually skipping steps. The odds are actually quite low for a single Stalker bolt rifle to do any damage. 17% is actually not very good. So because the attack sequence, you're multiplying probabilities, it goes lower and lower. So every time you have to roll the dice again and again and again, the probability of getting the outcome that you need gets lower and lower and lower. So the longer the attack sequence, the lower the probability. But the shorter the attack sequence, the higher the probability, because, again, we're using a D6 system here. So a psychic power, when you cast a psychic power and cause a mortal wound, really there's 2 rolls. One is the power goes off. The opponent can then deny it, but the denial is actually harder to do, kind of depending on the roll, and then you roll for the damage. So there's really 2 steps, and then if you're really careful, your opponent's not going to be in range to actually deny the power anyways. Mortal wounds oftentimes are a mechanic that is designed to be much more efficient at causing wounds than typical shooting or melee in this particular game. And you can see they created the mortal wound mechanic to sort of mimic the real heavy damage dealers in the game, but also it helps to deal with like the psychic powers in the game as well. So mortal wound, I think a lot of people don't like the mortal wound mechanic because it kind of sits outside of the typical attack sequence that you find in 40K, but I kind of like it because oftentimes you don't cause that many mortal wounds. Most things are limited by D3 mortal wounds or maybe 6 mortal wounds. It's difficult to cause a bunch of mortal wounds, buckets of mortal wounds. It's one of those mechanics that's actually, I think it's a good mechanic because it provides some lethality to some things in the game that probably should be more lethal than others. And mortal wounds are usually the volume that you can kick out is usually limited for the game. There are a couple circumstances where you can kick out 10, maybe 12 mortal wounds, depending on kind of what you're doing. AdMech have a couple ways with the Wrath of Mars stratagem. I'm thinking specifically that on average might cause about 8 mortal wounds, 8 to 12 mortal wounds. So there are some things out there that can be quite vicious when it comes to that. But for the most part, you're looking at fairly smaller dosages of mortal wounds. To improve your wounding efficiency, though, outside of mortal wounds, if you're just most of the time you're shooting or attacking in melee, but if you want to improve your efficiency, you can shorten the attack sequence with something like an auto hit weapon. So a flamer, for example, you don't roll to hit. You do roll the number of shots, though. So there is a roll, but at least you're not there's not a chance of failure. You're always going to hit, even if you roll a 1. It's only 1 hit, but you did hit. You didn't actually get a chance to fail there. You can have an AP that ignores a save. So you might be shooting at something that the Marine might be shooting a Stalker bolt rifle in the Devastator Doctrine at -2, and maybe he's shooting at, I don't know, Cultists or something. Well, the Cultist won't get a save. So that in that point, you're only having 2 steps, the roll to hit, the roll to wound, and then you're just picking up models after that. You can also change the rolls at each step by modifying what you can reasonably hit or wound. So that kind of what I mentioned earlier, if you're shooting at something and you're wounding on like 5s, for example, that's a pretty inefficient way to shoot. I mean, if that's all you have and that's the only target you have, it can be very inefficient trying to wound things on 5s unless, again, you have a volume of firepower. So you have to be kind of picky with what you're choosing to attack with. You can also use rerolls and modifiers to improve your chances. So if you're rerolling dice, or you're modifying the dice, in which case a 3-up goes to, say, a 2-up, or wounding goes from a 4-up to a 3-up. When you're starting to do that, you're actually improving your chances. So every time you can change the dice roll, and every time you can reroll a dice, those are also big boosts to the probability of causing a wound. Now, since I just mentioned it, let's talk about rerolls and modifiers. So as I talked about before, it's important to realize that every time you roll the dice, it's an individual event. So your chances of rolling a particular number is the same every time you roll the dice. So a reroll of 1, which is really the most common reroll in the game. You see reroll 1s kind of all the time. It does boost your probability hit and or wound, depending on obviously what you're rerolling. It actually doesn't matter whether you reroll a hit or a wound because the end result is the same. So rerolls of 1 will boost your probability, but rerolling everything really depends on the number you need to hit with. So if you're hitting on 2s or wounding on 2s, and you're rerolling all the dice, the actual percentage increase is about 13%. It's not really, it's good, but it's not amazing, which is why oftentimes hitting on 2s and rerolling always feels kind of like an academic exercise, because really it's not to say that it's not good. It's just that what you're not getting the most out of that reroll if it's already hitting on 2s. Now, if you're hitting on 3s and you're rerolling 1s and 2s, for example, it's about a 22% increase in conversion. So if you're hitting on 3s, it's slightly better. If you're hitting on 4s, it's about a 25% increase in conversion percentage. So really, if you look at the ideal one is I need to hit on 4s and I'm doing full rerolls. That is the most amount of efficiency of that particular reroll everything. If you're hitting on 5s, it starts to drop down to 22%, and then if you're hitting on 6s, it goes down to 13%. So it's kind of a bell curve. So if you have a hitting or wounding, if you have to roll a 4, I should say, whether it's a hit or a wound, if you have to roll a 4 and you get full rerolls, that is the way you're maxing out your reroll rule. If you're hitting on 3s or 2s, it's not quite as efficient. And if you're hitting on 5s or 6s, again, it's also not quite as efficient, and which makes sense because, first of all, when you have to hit on 2s, there's not going to be that many misses, and you're only rolling more die, and your chances are you'll get that number, but you're not going to miss that much in the first place. If you have to roll a 5 or a 6, you're going to have a lot of misses to begin with. You're going to get a full reroll, but that full reroll again also has to roll a 5 or a 6. Really, your full rerolls are the most efficient for a 4-up. One of the things you need to do when you start to build your army or to look at units is you want to maximize your rerolls. The best way to do rerolls is to reroll hit and to wound. If you can reroll on 2 steps of the attack sequence, the hit step and then the wounding step, if you get a reroll on both of those, it's actually more impactful because it's multiplicative. The boost you get in probability is multiplied because you're multiplying that across the attack sequence. So, for example, that Marine, he is hitting on 3s and he's wounding on 4s. A Marine shooting at another Marine with a Stalker bolt rifle, hits on 3s, wounds on 4s. That the probability of causing a wound with a reroll of 1 to hit or a reroll 1 to wound, it doesn't matter, goes from 34% to 39%. So before the saves happen, a Marine will wound another Marine at 34% of the time. But if you throw a reroll 1 in there, it goes from 34 to 39%. The probability of causing a wound with a reroll of 1 to hit and wound, it goes from 34 to 46%. So it actually does jump more than just simply adding together because it multiplies across both those steps. You get the most out of stacking hit and wound rerolls. If you can get both of those on a particular unit, it's actually more efficient than if you are rerolling ones to hit over here and you're rerolling ones to wound over there. Splitting them up, it might benefit 2 units, but if you have an alpha unit that you really want to do some damage and really want to push wounds through or cause wounds, it's better to stack those 2 things together. This is why the Space Marine Lieutenant is probably the hardest working model in the game right now, and he's usually followed up by a captain, or let's face it, a chapter master. Chapter masters are giving full rerolls to hit, which boosts probability quite a bit. And then the lieutenant, with that reroll of 1 to wound, boosts it even more. So the combination of the two actually is really makes for a really efficient offense for a particular unit. This is why the Archon, with the Blackheart Archon with the Writ of the Living Muse, because you're rerolling once to hit and you're rerolling once to wound, that makes those, usually you'll see 3 Ravagers with Disintegrator Cannons. Those 3 Ravagers are extremely efficient when you have an Archon that gives them the reroll 1 to hit and reroll the 1 to wound. So, Eldar have been doing this for years. Guide plus Doom, and then Jinx, we'll talk about that as in the modifier section, but Guide plus Doom has been it's like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. They just go together so well because guiding a unit and then dooming another unit is just incredibly efficient because you're rerolling everything to hit and you're rerolling everything to wound. Doom is extremely powerful because not only are you, it's unlike the Lieutenant who has to be within 6 inches of the units that are shooting or attacking. Doom is picking a unit and everybody can kind of dogpile on a particular unit. So you don't have that aura bubble that you have to stay in. So there's a limitation of a Lieutenant or an Archon, but with Doom, for example, it's just really, really powerful. To get the most out of your rerolls, try to maximize them as much as you can. Full rerolls tend to be, the efficiency goes up on a 4-up. But if you're less than that or more than that, it's not quite as efficient. But to maximize the most of it, you're trying to reroll at both steps, the hit step and the wound step. Now, that Marine example, let's say he's in range of a captain and he's in range of a lieutenant. So he is rerolling once to hit and he's rerolling once to wound. So he's causing a wound to another Marine about 46% of the time. But that bolter has a -1 AP. The thing is, you may cause a wound 46% of the time, but there's still the 3rd step in the attack sequence, and that's the save. So there is still a 50% chance that the wound is save, which leads us kind of to the next important part of Mathhammer and the rules that impact Mathhammer. Modifiers to hit or wound are more impactful than like a reroll of 1. They are a lot more scarce in the game. It's more difficult to see a +1 to wound. So something like, Chaos has had Veterans of Long War, and that is a fantastic stratagem because a +1 to wound is a really, really, really powerful mechanic because you're going, again, we have a D6 system. There's only 6 possible chances you can do. If you can move from a 5 to a 4 or a 4 to a 3, that will have a much greater impact on your probability and your chance of causing a wound than even a reroll will. So we'll take the Marine example. If that Marine is hitting on 2s, the probability of causing a wound goes from 34% to 42%, which is more than if you had to just reroll a 1. If you modify the wound roll of 4 to a 3, the probability goes from 34 to 45. Modifiers have a greater effect if you modify the value that is worse. So if you are hitting on 3s and you bump that up to like hitting +1 to hit, and now you're hitting on 2s, for example, that will have a pretty good effect, but it won't have as much of an impact for going from like a 4 to a 3. So the higher the chance, or the lower the odds of the higher the dice roll needed, the more impact the modifier will have on that particular dice roll. So that particular Marine example, he's hitting on 3s and he's wounding on 4s. If you modify the hit roll to a 2, the probability of causing a wound goes from 34 to 42%. If you modify the wound roll of a 4-up to a 3-up, the probability of causing a wound goes from 34 to 45%. So you can see that modifiers have more of an impact for the higher numbers needed in the game. This is why the Red Thirst for Blood Angels with a +1 to wound in melee is actually better than the Space Wolves Hunter Unleashed, which gives you a +1 to hit in melee. Oftentimes for Marines, they are hitting usually on 3s, and so to go from a 3 to a 2, it has a pretty good impact. I mean, it's powerful, no doubt, but it's not nearly as impactful as going from like a 5 to a 4. So a Marine, a strength 4, like a scout who has strength 4, when he's wounding things on 4s rather than 5s, that's a much bigger impact than the Space Wolves, who are hitting things goes from a 3 to a 2. So to remember, modifiers are best when you modify the roll that is worse. Rerolls and modifiers have big impacts on units in this game. So when you start to look at your stratagems, your warlord traits, your relics, you are looking for things in other units, for example. You're looking for those rules that provide rerolls and that provide modifiers. Let's talk about a case where a unit on paper feels like it should do the job that it's been rules designed to do. And this is the Vindicare Assassin targeting a guard commander. The Vindicare, despite having a stack of rules, cannot reliably kill probably one of the weaker characters in the game. Now, guard commanders are extremely useful. They have the voice of command ability, and they are useful in a guard army, but they are only T3, and they have a 5-up save. Now, they're protected by the character rule, but the Vindicare doesn't care because he's a sniper. Now, the Vindicare hits on a 2. He wounds infantry on a 2. His rifle will ignore that guard commander save. So right away, it's a 2+, a 2+. So it's 83% times 83%, and there's no save. And you multiply those together, the probability of causing a wound is 69%, which is not as good as you think. And this is why oftentimes, I've taken Vindicares and it's just, it feels inevitable that they either really roll hot or they just miss. Because really 69% of the time, they will cause a wound, but that leaves 31% of the time when they're not causing anything. So even when you cause a wound, you roll for damage. And the damage on their rifle is D3, which means there's only a 33% chance that you'll get 3 wounds through. So you're just as likely to roll 1 wound as you are to roll 2 wounds, as you are to roll 3 wounds. But let's say for the sake of argument that you roll a 5 or a 6, thereby pushing through 3 damage to that guard commander. The problem is the guard commander has 4 wounds. The company commander has 4 wounds. So from there, you need to rely on the headshot rule. And the rules designers did a good job of D3 damage is not, but it's okay. It seems appropriate, but oftentimes you need to have something additional to that. So they created the thing called the headshot rule. And the headshot rule basically means that if you cause a wound, you roll a dice. On a 3-up, a mortal wound, that unit suffers a mortal wound. And then you roll again. On a 4-up, it suffers another mortal wound. And then on a 5-up, it suffers another mortal wound, and then so on. So because you require a 3-up to cause that last 4th wound, it's a 67% chance, because remember, 3-up is a 67% chance to get a 3-up. So your probability to kill the guard commander, even if you score 3 damage, is only 49%. And that is, the 33% likely. There's only 33% chance you're actually going to score 3 damage to begin with. But even if everything goes your way, you're still only going to kill that guard commander half the time. So a Vindicare Assassin, because of each step in the dice sequence makes it more and more difficult. A Vindicare Assassin in which the rules say okay, this guy is a character killer. He's gonna take out a lot of these weak characters. Really, the odds are not that amazing. They're decent, but they're not amazing. And there's not much more you could probably do to boost it up, because I think the rules seem to indicate that that's about as strong as it gets. But that Vindicare is going to need several turns or a couple of his friends to also shoot at the same guard commander just in case he misses. And this is where we get volume of attacks. Now, volume of attacks can come in a single turn or a single phase, or it can occur throughout the game. But we've talked about the probability of a single attack causing a wound, but in Warhammer, you have multiple attacks. So in the case of orcs, you have buckets of attacks. And this is where even if the probability of causing a wound, or marine to marine, is only 17%, if you've got 10 Marines or 20 Marines or other things shooting, that's where kind of the randomness of the game comes into play. But also you can overcome it feels like, on paper, when you math it out, the weakness or the low probability of these things. Now, you can determine an average number of damage per unit by averaging the damage for multi-damage weapons if it's a D3 or a D6. If it's a flat number, then obviously it doesn't matter. You can also then multiply by number of shots. Now, when you start to do this, when you take a probability and you multiply by the number of shots, and you multiply that by the damage, you're getting an average. And so you're moving out of the realm of probability and into averages. And this is where you kind of have to be a little bit careful about this. And most Mathhammer apps give you average damage, but the more dice you roll, the more likely, the more variation you're going to have over time. But if you have, let's say, let's take our Marine example. 10 Marines shooting Stalker bolt rifles at AP -1, damage 2, at another unit of Primaris Marines, which have 2 wounds, T4. You could take the damage of 2 and multiply it by 0.17 or 17. Then again by 10 to get an average wounds caused of 3.4, which is kind of odd because you actually can't score 3.4 wounds because the most you could score is in multiples of 2 because it's damage 2. But this is how you get the averages. So on average, a unit of Primaris Marines with Stalker bolt rifles can kill one model and wound another. But again, you can't really get that. So on average, you're going to kill 1 or 2 Space Marines. Before you start the game and you look at your unit of Marines with Stalker bolt rifles, and you say, okay, I'm going to use this unit to shoot at another unit of Marines, you have to know that on average, you're probably going to kill 1, maybe 2, assuming there's no rerolls, assuming there's no modifiers. Rerolls and modifiers will increase your chances of causing more Marines, more opponents' Marines to be picked up. But for the most part, you're still looking at averages here. And variance happens because that same unit of 10 Marines could cause 0 wounds. Or it could cause 20 wounds. The likelihood of it causing 20 wounds, meaning everything scores, everything wounds, and everything is unsaved, is really, really low, but it's there. So 0 to 20 is kind of the range of wounds that particular unit can cause. And the probability goes up depending on what it's shooting at. It's much more likely that unit of Marines, those 10 Marines with Stalker bolt rifles, will cause more wounds to, say, Guardsmen, because Guardsmen are getting less of a save. The wound roll is not a 4-up, it goes to a 3-up. Depending on what its target is, it's more likely to cause or less likely to cause wounds to whatever that opponent is shooting at. So variance happens. You have to be careful when you look at averages. But what is really most useful is when you look at a particular unit and you're kind of hammering it out, what I like to do is I like to look at it, what is the average damage of this unit against, say, a unit of guard, like T3 5-up saves, or against the unit of, like, say, dire Avengers or light infantry. So T3 models with about 4 or 5-up saves. What is it against Marines? What is it against Primaris Marines? What is it against light vehicles like T6 with maybe a 4 or 5-up save? What is it against 4 or 5-up save after the AP, I should say? What is it against heavier vehicles? What is it against knights? And so oftentimes when you're looking at the average damage of a unit, and it's not difficult to calculate. Again, I'm kind of giving the attack sequence, and all you have to do is multiply by number of shots and then by damage. It's not difficult to calculate it. It's most useful, though, when you're looking at all of the different types or buckets or categories of units that unit can go after. And what it does is it gives you, like, what is the most efficient shooting that this thing, what are the best things for this unit to target? Like, what can I target with this unit? What is it most efficient at destroying? And that's where kind of Mathhammer becomes really interesting. But you do have to watch out when you look at calculating averages. They serve as a guideline, but it's not always going to happen. Usually what happens, in my experience, is when you need something to happen, if you need average dice rolls, quote-unquote average dice rolls, you need that 10-man squad of Marines with Stalker bolt rifles to pick up 2 Marines. There's 2 Marines left. When you're banking on average, oftentimes it's just, that's when your dice go cold. That's when the randomness comes in and you may score 0. You may not wound anything. Or your opponent might save everything. But either way, it's all part of that same attack sequence. So a volume of shots makes up for the poor probability or just the general probability of weapons to cause a wound. So if you need to hit a wound on 5, for example, the probability is quite low. So you're going to need volume to make up for that, or you're going to need rerolls or modifiers, preferably all 3. again, the Marine example I'm shooting at, and I need to kill 2 Marines, I can't bank on that single unit of 10 Marines to kill those 2 Marines. I will need something else as kind of the safety, like the backup plan. And it's useful to always have backup plans. So the more targets a unit can engage with, the better off you are, because at that point, if you don't get it with one unit, you have another unit to kind of help you out in that respect. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about AP, or armor penetration value. Now, the best save is no save. So the Vindicare shooting at a company commander, there is no save because it's like AP -3 and the company commander has a 5-up. But you do pay a lot of points for an AP value that is high enough to ignore a lot of the saves in the game. The highest is typically a -4. There are some -5s, but you see a lot of -4 in some of the dedicated anti-tank weapons. We're talking Meltas, we're talking Lances. Those are usually weapons that are designed to go after high toughness units. So other vehicles, for example, a Melta or a Bright Lance, or Dark Lance, which is the same thing, but it's the Dark Eldar version of it. Those are meant to go after vehicles, and that's kind of what they're built around, and that's why they have the AP of -4. But you pay in points for that kind of efficiency. Invulnerable saves are, you see them often on really tough units, and typically characters or high toughness units with an invul save basically means your AP once you push the AP, you push the save up to the invul, and that's where it stops. So any AP over that invul is kind of wasted. So for example, Necron Wraiths have a 3-up invul. If you're shooting weapons that are more than -1 at it, it's kind of a waste, because that unit's going to get their invuls anyways. Better to shoot a more heavy volume firepower without any kind of AP at a unit like Necron Wraith, for example, just because they'll always get their invul anyways. So whatever their AP, it's wasted at that point. Now, what are the APs that are the best? Well, I mean, really, again, you're paying points for AP, and the Marine tactical doctrines are actually really powerful because they give out AP values, but turn to turn. Now that you're actually forced to move from one turn to the next and change your doctrines, the Marines are actually interesting because some of their weapons become much more efficient depending on the turn of the game. I find that -2 is a really good, value AP, in that you're not paying an insane amount of points for them usually, but they'll always take away the armor save or the cover save of that unit and bump them up. If they have an invul, it'll take them up to the invul. So typically they're saving on 5s at that point. Or for Marine and cover, they'll save on 4s, which is still pretty good. Ignores cover, though, is also important now, because we're seeing armies that have rules that provide cover outside of 12 inches. Units get cover saves without even actually having to be in cover. So ignores cover kind of is the sort of the flip side of that, and ignores cover is like free AP. So if you have a weapon that has very low AP value or none, ignores cover is actually really quite powerful. So with Eldar, I'm running Night Spinners in some of my lists, and Night Spinners have an AP 0 unless it's a 6, in which case it's AP 4. So the AP value is really, really, really swingy. I have found, though, that I really want to ignore cover with those Night Spinners, because those Night Spinners are indirect fire. So I'm going to often be shooting at things that are actually sitting in cover. So I want to pump up or move up that save as much as I can. If I don't take the ignores cover, Marines are going to get a 2-up, and a 2-up is 83% chance they're going to pass a 2-up save. So I don't want them that. I want them to actually have to take a 3-up armor save. Thunderfire cannons in a Imperial Fist list, because the Thunderfire cannon natively only has -1, but turn 1 in the Devastator Doctrine, it's -2. Because Imperial Fists ignore cover, it's almost like having a -3 depending on what it's shooting at. So as you look across data slates, always look for an AP value and look for sort of the ignores cover rule on those kinds of units that have very low AP. Like I said, like Night Spinners, for example. -2 to me is always a great value AP. I'm taking a lot more Eldari missile launchers because I like -2 a lot. Yes, they still get a save, which is still a chance to not push a wound through, but at the same time, it's actually quite effective. Let's talk a little more about randomness in 40K. Some of the most devastating weapons in the game are also the most streaky. Anytime you have to roll for the number of shots and the number of damage, you're adding an element of randomness that can really kind of mess up the math. So the Doomsday Cannon on the Doomsday Arc is a really powerful weapon, but it has D6 shots. So it's strength 10, AP -5, which means that outside of an invul save, no unit in the game is going to get a save unless it has an invul, but it's also D6 damage. This is an incredible amount of randomness to a really good weapon. You could inflict 0 wounds, or you could inflict 36 wounds just by a single shot from the Doomsday Cannon. The average against a T6 and up vehicle, so a vehicle that is a T6 or more, in other words, it would have to be a 3 up to wound. The average is, the math says, about 4 wounds. But because these units are so swingy, you can't really count on it always causing 4 wounds. You kind of either have to know that it's going to do nothing, or it's just going to pick a model up off the table. And this is why you see Necrons running 3 of them, because oftentimes when you have a really streaky unit like that with random elements, you want the redundancy, because if one whiffs, then the other one might do better. But 3 of these things over the course of a couple turns before they themselves are destroyed, chances are the averages will kind of come back around, but you have to give it a chance. And you have to just roll more dice. You need more volume of dice. In this case, having 3 of them is 3 different chances to do this, but also the longer they stay alive, the more chances they get to come around to whatever the average dice rolls would be. Because this unit is so streaky, to me, randomness like that, especially random shots or random damage, especially both, I would much rather have a damage 2 than a D3, for example. Or I'd much rather have a 3 damage versus a D6 damage, just because it's just more consistent and it's easier to plan on too. It's easier in the game to sort of figure out exactly what kind of the ideal targets are. It's nothing as disheartening as scoring a wound, having your opponents fail a save, and then rolling a 1 on a D6 damage. It's a real bummer. Because it happens. You're just as likely to roll anything. When you're rolling a damage, it's a single dice roll of a D6, and you have a 1 in 6 chance of rolling any of those numbers. Let's talk about defense now. So moving from offense to defense. Well, defense is really to improve your saving efficiency. You're doing the opposite of what you would do to increase your efficiency. So some of the things you could do. You can lengthen the attack sequence by having an ignores wound, or it used to be called feel no pain, but having an ignores wound, which is for Marines, you have an apothecary nearby. For Eldar unit, you have fortune cast on it. For some stratagems, gives you ignores wounds on a 5, for example. But a way to increase your save is to add that as another step in the process of ignoring damage. You could change the rolls at each step with a -1 to hit or a -1 to wound, or both. -1 to hit being one of the more prevalent. Flyers are -1 to hit, so for example, so they have a built-in level. So flyers have a -1, so they have a built-in level of saving efficiency there. There's a few rules in the game where there's a -1 to wound. The Harlequins have a Shadow Seer that is, I think, a -1 to wound. It's rare, but those are actually really powerful abilities. You can improve the save with cover saves, so being in cover or getting a cover save, or taking units with invuls, especially like a 4-up or a 5-up, meaning that your opponent's AP would be wasted on you. Those are always beneficial. You can also lessen the damage with -1 damage abilities. So we're seeing a lot more of these now in the game. So the Space Marines have one for the Dreadnought where you can reduce damage by 1, for example. There are a couple cases. Tau and Iron Hands have, you can pass off wounds. Sometimes you have bodyguard units that can pass off wounds. That's obviously another way to increase your defense, but those are sort of limited to just a handful of cases. But that is the ultimate in defense, because the unit you want to keep going, if you have a rule like that, it's going to go for a long time. And then, of course, you can simply increase the volume of defense by just having more models or more wounds on the table that your opponent has to remove. So there is a defense in volume. Some of the classic denial lists, and denial lists are lists that have lots of units that are really tough and hard to remove, and the units will win the game simply by standing somewhere and not dying. Plague Bears, for example, they have a 5-up invul, so whatever, doesn't really matter what the AP is, they're going to get a 5-up save. They have a 5-up ignores wound, so they'll always get a 5-up and a 5-up to save a wound, and then they get a -1 to hit when they have a certain amount in a unit. So they're using a modifier. They have an invul to remove the effects of AP 3 or more. They're increasing the attack sequence or the defense sequence. They're increasing the attack sequence by including a feel no pain or ignores wound, and they have a modifier tossed in as a -1, and they can also go from a 5-up to a 4-up invul if they want. These Plague Bears, especially in large bricks too, and then you're also increasing the volume of them by taking 29, 30 of them, they have a really frightening amount of defense. It's very difficult to shift a unit like that, especially when it's got kind of buffs on it. Primaris Marines with 2 wounds take a lot of dedicated firepower to get rid of. So let's say you take 30 of these guys, 3 units of 10, in an Iron Hands list with the Iron Father. The Iron Father gives them a 5-up invul. So that means that any AP over 3 is just kind of wasted. So they always get a 5-up invul, regardless of what's shooting at them. Then you take an Apothecary to give them a 5-up ignores wound. This makes them extremely resilient. So there are various ways around this to make very classic tough things to shift. But those Marines, one of the other things that makes them tough is they have 2 wounds each. So damage 1 weapons are really inefficient at shooting a brick of Primaris Marines. When you have units with multiple models with multiple wounds, and especially if they have a ignores wound cast on them or an ability nearby, it makes them actually really, really difficult to shift. If those Plague Bears were 2 wounds each, they'd be impossible in this game. There's just no way. It'd be very difficult. But those Primaris Marines with the Iron Hands, with the Iron Father and the Apothecary nearby, are like that, except they shoot back. All right, so that's the defense part of Mathhammer. So now let's take a break. We've been talking for a while, and let's hear a word from our sponsor, TraderA.com. If you're like most Warhammer players, you own a ton of models. At one time, you had big plans for these models, but now they just kind of sit, gathering dust, unused and unloved. It's time to clean out your closet of shame. Visit TraderA.com and get cash for your used models. TraderA is run by Captain A, someone who's been in the community a long time and has done a lot to grow the hobby. He's also a personal friend of the show. Unopened boxes, models on a sprue, half-built models, primed, painted, even bits have value. The process is simple. Send him a list of what you have, he'll send you a quote, you pack it up, send in your stuff, and he'll get you cash. You can shop around, but you're going to find that TraderA gives you 40% more than the other guys. You want it quick, you want to get rid of it, visit TraderA.com. Get cash to buy the stuff that you really want. TraderA.com. Sell your models and get your cash quick and easy. Okay, and we're back. So to recap some of the stuff we talked about today, we talked a little bit about how to calculate the probability of causing a wound. It's a pretty simple calculation. You use the probabilities for the D6 system, and you simply multiply them by the number of steps it takes. So a 3-up, 4-up, 4-up is 67% times 50% times 50%, which is 17% probability of causing a wound or getting a successful result, essentially. That's the simple calculation for most things in Mathhammer. If you want to look at averages, you can take that 17% and you can multiply it by the number of damage you might cause for whatever the weapon you're shooting at, and then you're multiplying it again by the number of models or the number of shots. And that will give you the average damage, and that is the sort of classic Mathhammer. What's the average damage this thing can cause? This Unit A can cause shooting at or attacking Unit B. So Mathhammer really is about comparing units to units to see, when you're comparing a bunch of different kinds of units, to see what is the most efficient opponents or the most efficient things this unit should go after, should shoot at or to attack. And that's the essence of Mathhammer. You don't have to do it for everything, but it's good to sit down with your units and kind of figure out like what is it best at killing. Always try to maximize your rerolls. And rerolls to hit and wound are even more impactful. That's why the craft world trait, expert crafters, is so powerful, or the salamander's trait. When you're rerolling once to hit and rerolling once to wound, it's more impactful than doing either one of those in a vacuum. So if you get a reroll on a hit and a wound, it's even more so than if you just got one or the other. You want to look for any kind of modifiers that you can find, because modifiers have an even more powerful impact than simple rerolls. Modifiers are best when used for rolls that are worse. The higher the roll, the more impactful the modifier. So modifiers and rerolls are the things you want to look for when you start to build your army list. You need to remember that volume of attacks can make up for poor probability of weapons. So it's not enough to have something that has really great stats with a lot of support with rerolls and modifiers. You need multiple ones of that, or you need other things that can do kind of that same job. So you need the volume to kind of get through the probability, because even in the best of circumstances, think of that Vindicare. That Vindicare is only killing a company commander less than half the time. And those aren't really great odds. Those are not great odds for that model, which, looking at the data slate, seems like it should be doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. So volume will often make up for the poor probability of a lot of units in this game. AP value, I think AP -2 is a great AP to look for, but any kind of AP on a weapon is worthwhile, and especially now that we're seeing a lot of units that can take cover out in the open, ignores cover acts as a form of AP. Random elements in the game happen, so oftentimes I don't like to look at random things. I try to avoid rolling for a number of shots or rolling for a number of damage, just because those things can be just really, really swingy and difficult to prepare for, to plan for. If you have those kind of units that have really swingy stuff, because that maybe your codex only has, like Necrons, only has access to that heavy firepower, but that heavy firepower has a variable number of shots or a variable number of damage, then you have to take enough of that, and you have to keep that alive for enough turns that you'll eventually get the averages. Over time, the dice will kind of settle into an average. But if you're relying on kind of those Hail Mary things to happen, often it just doesn't happen very often. So you need to have backup in many cases. Redundancy and volume is your friend here. For defensive purposes, to make something tough, you want to lengthen the attack sequence with an ignores wound roll. You want to change the rolls at the step, so it's either -1 to hit or -1 to wound. You want to improve the save with cover saves or invuls on key units. And you want to lessen the damage with -1 damage abilities. It's the flip side of what you might do for offense. Those are some of the guidelines and some of the rules that I use when I look at sort of Mathhammer, and I start to go through my codex and I look at the different data slates, but not just the data slates, but the stratagems, the warlord traits, the psychic powers, the things that impact a unit, and then other units as well. Really, this game now is a game of auras and buffing, and taking key model units and making them perform much more. They're much more lethal. The more that you can add to it, the more that you can provide rerolls, the more you can modify, the more you can do to buff that thing up, the more lethal it becomes. And that's kind of what the game is right now. You're not really just playing what's on the data slate. You're looking at a data slate and comparing the other things that can make that either more efficient at offense or a much more survivable unit, depending on the role that it has. You can take a lot of units in the game and make them really powerful or make them really strong and defensive, but then you kind of have to get the trade-off of like, what do I have to do in order to get this thing to really, really be efficient? Sometimes that trade-off is not worth it. It might be just too expensive to do something like that. But if it's easy enough to get units to to increase their probability, their efficiency, then, it's something to consider. The expert crafter's trait for Craft World Eldar is great because it's a craft world. You're giving up another craft world trait, but to give an entire army a reroll 1 to hit and a reroll 1 to wound is a really, really powerful ability because you've just boosted the probability of every single unit, the offensive output of every unit in that army by quite a bit. Those are the kinds of things you look for when you're looking at making units better, either more powerful or more survivable. So that is all we have for Mathhammer. Thank you so much for listening to the show. Now, before I sign off, we did a Black Library episode a couple months back, and we're going to do it again. And we wanted to give you kind of a sneak peek of the 2 books that we are going to be comparing and discussing in our next Black Library episode. I'm not entirely sure when we'll actually air that. It's probably going to be in a few months here, because right now, as I speak, we're still under shelter-in-place social distancing guidelines. We're kind of in the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic right now, so we're not entirely sure what the future holds over the next several months. But the next time we can get together, we will do another Black Library Book Club. And what we are reading right now, we're going to compare 2 novels. We'll be comparing 2 novels again that have kind of a similar sort of topics, but from 2 different authors. So we're reading Imperator, Wrath of the Omnissiah by Gav Thorpe, and we'll be comparing that to Titanicus by Dan Abnett. So the 2 books we're going to be reading for our next Black Library episode, which will to be determined, but we're going to be reading Imperator, Wrath of the Omnissiah by Gav Thorpe, and Titanicus by Dan Abnett. So if you want to follow along with our Black Library episode, pick up those 2 books and start reading now when we discuss them. We'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Thank you so much for listening to the show. We love to hear from our listeners, so please feel free to message us on Facebook or email us at thebattlehosts@gmail.com. If you'd like to support us, you can help us in a few different ways. You can tell your friends about us and like us on Facebook. You can subscribe to us on YouTube, and you can leave a review on iTunes, which does help to boost our listening audience. Finally, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/thebattlehosts. For as little as $1 a month, you can help us with the cost of running the show and staying engaged with the 40K community. So thank you so much for listening to The Battlehosts. Remember to be a better gamer and to build a better community. Good night.